You know, getting older is a funny thing. When I was young, I never thought much about my neighbors or even my relatives beyond the occasional holiday gathering. But as the years went by, those little interactions, especially the people living nearby or the family who check in now and then, started to play a much bigger role in my life. It's like as your world gets smaller, the people around you become larger in importance, for better or for worse. Take my story, for example. I used to live in this cozy little neighborhood in Chicago. I had my daily routine: coffee on the porch, a walk down to the park, and on weekends, a chat with folks at the corner shop. Simple, peaceful. That was, until a new neighbor moved in next door. Let's call him Tom. Now, Tom was, well, he was what you might call a real busybody. He was always hanging around, popping his head over the fence with a question or comment about what I was doing when my family came to visit, or even how I trimmed my hedges. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, maybe a little nosy. But as time went on, Tom seemed to always be there watching, even when I didn't want the company. It got to the point where stepping out for a breath of fresh air felt like walking into an interrogation. And you know, at my age, I just want a bit of peace. I started to realize there are certain types of neighbors, no matter where you live or how friendly you try to be, that are just better avoided. But it wasn't just Tom. Over the years, I encountered all sorts of folks who made life a little more challenging, like the neighbor who always seemed to have a complaint, or the distant cousin who only called when he needed money. And I've heard stories from friends too, like my buddy George, who has a sister who keeps tabs on his every move, or Mary, who had a neighbor constantly dragging her into every little neighborhood spat. That's what I want to talk about today. The people who, as we get older, we're just better off keeping a bit of distance from. Not out of bitterness or anger, but because a peaceful, happy life often means knowing who to let close and who to keep at arm's length. So, let's dive in and chat about the 3 types of neighbors and the 3 types of relatives that, believe me, are better loved from afar. Number 1, the nosy neighbor. Now, as I mentioned, Tom, my neighbor back in Chicago, was the kind of guy who just had to know everything. He'd ask questions like, "Who was that young man who visited you last week?" referring to my grandson, who had come over to help me fix a leaky faucet. It was innocent at first, just a curious question here and there. But pretty soon, Tom was tracking my every move. One afternoon, I caught him peeking through his blinds while I was gardening. I thought to myself, well, maybe he's just lonely. I tried to be understanding and give him the benefit of the doubt, but he soon started pushing it. He'd come over uninvited, often when I was in the middle of something, and ask for updates on my life as if he were keeping a record. He'd comment on my family's comings and goings, and once even suggested that I should have my friends over less because they parked in his spot on the street. People like Tom don't necessarily mean harm, but the constant prying can weigh you down over time. And in our later years, we treasure our peace and privacy even more. It's true that neighbors can be a blessing, helping to keep an eye out or lending a hand when needed, but some cross a line, turning from neighborly to intrusive. I found myself withdrawing more, hesitating to go outside or enjoy my garden, all because of this unspoken pressure from Tom's watchful eye. Eventually, I realized that setting boundaries, even in simple ways like a polite hello without much more, was necessary for my own peace of mind. Number 2, the complaining neighbor. Now, another type of neighbor to be mindful of is the chronic complainer. I think most of us have met someone like this in one form or another. For me, it was back in my old neighborhood when Marge moved in across the street. Marge had a keen eye for every single tiny thing she thought was wrong. She'd complain about the tree leaves falling in her yard, about the kids playing too loudly 2 houses down, or even about the speed at which I mowed my lawn. I never quite understood what that last one was about. She had an almost magical ability to find something wrong no matter where she looked. It wasn't just the frequency of her complaints. It was the way she brought this kind of negativity to everyone around her. Whenever I'd be out front, even just taking out the trash, Marge would march over with a new list of grievances. It was exhausting, and if she didn't get a reaction, she'd find someone else to drag into her web of discontent. For those of us who simply want a calm, positive environment, this constant negativity can drain you before you even realize it. I remember my friend Walter once saying, "It's not our job to be everyone's therapist," and that hit home for me. We can lend an ear and share kindness, but we shouldn't be the target of a never-ending storm of complaints. It's okay to distance ourselves from those who seem determined to bring a cloud over every sunny day. Number 3. The favor neighbor. The third type of neighbor to be cautious of is what I call the favor neighbor. Now, don't get me wrong, being neighborly is a wonderful thing. I was always the kind of man who'd lend a hand, whether it was helping a friend put up Christmas lights or bringing in mail for someone on vacation. But there are some neighbors who don't understand balance. For them, a favor isn't a once-in-a-while ask, it's a routine. I remember a woman named Linda from my early retirement years. She was always dropping by, asking for just a little favor. First, it was borrowing a ladder, then watering her plants, then watching her dog every other weekend. Soon, she was asking me to run errands for her or even pick up her medication. It got to the point where I felt more like her personal assistant than her neighbor. I'm sure Linda wasn't intending to be demanding, but after a while, I realized that I had started rearranging my days around her needs instead of my own. It's important to remember, especially as we get older, that our time and energy are valuable. I eventually had to find a gentle way to tell Linda that I couldn't always be available. I learned that setting boundaries isn't about being unkind. It's about preserving our well-being and time for the things that matter to us. These are just a few examples of neighbors who, while they may not mean harm, can easily intrude on the peace and happiness we strive for in our later years. Life is too short to spend it feeling monitored, pulled into negativity, or overly relied upon. So a polite smile, a kind word, and some healthy distance can go a long way in maintaining a peaceful life. Next, we'll talk about family. Just as some neighbors may best be loved from a distance, certain relatives can also drain us if we're not careful. I'll start with the first type of family member to keep a bit of distance from: the overly concerned relative. Number 1. The overly concerned relative. Now don't get me wrong, having family who cares for you is a blessing. I'm grateful for my daughter Sarah, who always calls to check in. But there's a fine line between caring and overstepping. And some relatives tend to cross that line without even realizing it. My cousin Edna, for instance, is one of those folks. She's always been well-meaning, but as I got older, her concern grew into what I can only describe as something like supervision. Every time we'd talk, Edna would have a list of suggestions for me. It was everything from what I should eat to how often I should exercise, even which friends I should or shouldn't be spending time with. She'd ask, "Are you really okay living alone?" Or, "Wouldn't it be better if you moved closer to family?" And while I know she meant well, her constant suggestions started to feel more like judgments. I felt like I was being treated as if I couldn't manage my own decisions. For many of us, especially as we get older, retaining our independence is a point of pride. We've lived full lives, made our choices, and navigated our share of ups and downs. Having someone questioning every little decision can be exhausting, even if they're coming from a place of love. I remember feeling a bit of resentment creeping in, and it wasn't something I wanted to feel towards a family member I cared about. Eventually, I had to find a gentle way to set boundaries with Edna. I thanked her for her concern, but reassured her that I was quite content and capable of making choices for myself. It took a few tries, but she eventually understood. And with that little bit of distance, our relationship actually improved. She respected my independence, and I felt less pressure to justify my every move. Number 2. The perpetually needy relative. Now, we all know someone in the family who always seems to be in a bit of a mess and expects the rest of us to pick up the pieces. For me, that person is my nephew, Jim. Jim is a good kid at heart, but he has a tendency to turn to me and to others in the family whenever things go awry. Whether it's financial trouble, relationship drama, or even job issues. I've lost count of the number of times Jim has called me up, needing just a little help to get through whatever issue he's facing at the moment. At first, I was glad to lend a hand. Family sticks together, after all. But over time, I began to realize that my assistance wasn't really helping him. it was enabling him. He relied on me as a safety net instead of learning to handle things himself. And if I'm being honest, it started to wear on me emotionally and financially. One day, Jim showed up at my door unannounced, asking for yet another loan to cover some overdue bills. That's when I had to face the hard truth. Helping him wasn't doing either of us any good. So I sat him down and told him, gently but firmly, that while I loved him dearly, I couldn't continue to bail him out every time something went wrong. It was a difficult conversation, but it was necessary for both of us. I wanted Jim to stand on his own 2 feet and not feel that he needed someone to fix things for him every time. Sometimes, as we grow older, we feel obligated to step in and help family members who are struggling. But there's a point where helping can become a burden, and that's when we have to make the tough choice to set boundaries. It's not easy, but protecting our own peace of mind and resources becomes more important with age. Family is important, but so is preserving the energy we need for our own well-being. Number 3, the critical relative. Finally, there's the family member who always seems to have a critique, no matter what we do. I think every family has at least one. For me, it's my brother-in-law, Frank. Now, Frank is one of those people who has an opinion on everything. And while I value different viewpoints, Frank's comments often feel less like advice and more like criticism. For instance, if I mention that I've been enjoying some new hobbies, like painting or gardening, Frank will find a way to throw in a critical comment. Well, at your age, you should be careful about that. Or if I share that I've been taking more time to relax, he'll chime in with, "You don't want to let yourself get lazy now." Even little things, like a new hat I bought, would draw a comment about how it wasn't really my style. After a while, I realized that no matter what I did, Frank would find something to critique. And truth be told, his words started getting under my skin. They made me question my choices and feel a bit less confident. It's surprising how even small, constant criticisms can chip away at our happiness and self-esteem if we let them. One day, I decided to let go of my need for his approval. I learned to accept that I couldn't change Frank's personality, but I could choose how much his opinions affected me. So, I started politely redirecting the conversation whenever he got too critical or simply nodding along without letting his words sink in. And with that, I regained a sense of confidence and peace. So, those are 3 types of relatives who, for the sake of our own happiness, we might be better off keeping at a little distance. Sometimes, the best way to maintain a good relationship with family is by setting clear boundaries. After all, as we grow older, peace of mind and a little freedom from stress become priceless gifts we can give to ourselves. That brings us to the end of the family section. Let's remember, family and neighbors can enrich our lives, but knowing when to step back is just as important. As we get older, we realize that not everyone in our lives adds the same value. Our time and energy become precious, and it's worth asking ourselves who brings joy and who leaves us feeling drained. The truth is, maintaining healthy relationships isn't just about who we welcome into our lives, but also about who we might choose to keep at a polite distance. But distancing doesn't mean cutting people out or harboring resentment. It's simply about learning to protect our peace so that we can spend our days with a sense of comfort and joy. Let's take a closer look at the idea of balanced relationships. In all honesty, the word boundary is something that many of us might feel is a bit foreign. When we were growing up, especially in my day, the notion of setting boundaries with family or neighbors wasn't talked about much. It was assumed that if someone needed help, you'd give it. If someone asked a question, you'd answer it, no matter how personal it was. That was just the way things were done. But as I've learned in my later years, boundaries aren't about pushing people away. They're about letting others know how to respect your time, space, and emotional energy. Just like a fence around a garden, a boundary isn't meant to keep everything out. It's just there to protect what's important inside. And when done respectfully, boundaries can actually make relationships stronger. For instance, with my neighbor Tom, setting that boundary helped us keep things friendly without overstepping. With my cousin Edna, it helped us connect in a way that didn't leave me feeling like my choices were constantly questioned. And with my nephew Jim, It taught him to be a little more independent while helping me preserve my resources. It wasn't always easy to have those conversations, but the result was worth it. One of the things I've learned from experience is that when you have a circle of people who truly support and understand you, life becomes so much richer. It's like having a warm quilt around you. Each person contributes a patch, bringing their own warmth and strength. But if some patches are frayed or scratchy, it can make the whole quilt feel uncomfortable. As we grow older, we might find that we appreciate people who share our values, who understand our need for peace and respect our independence. These are the people who will let us enjoy our days without unnecessary stress or judgment, and who will be there when we need a friend. I've come to value the friends who simply sit with me in quiet company, the family members who call just to say hello without asking for anything, and the neighbors who give a wave without needing to know all my business. In our later years, life has a way of reminding us to slow down, to find joy in the simple moments, and to be careful with how we spend our energy. A peaceful walk, a warm cup of tea, or a good book can be more valuable than ever. And those little moments are best enjoyed when there's no added stress from complicated relationships. I often think of my friend Martha, who once told me, "Less is more, especially when it comes to people." Martha used to have a wide social circle, always busy with one event or another. But as she got older, she started spending more time with just a handful of friends and family members who truly made her happy. She'd say, "I may have fewer people around now, but the ones I have mean the world to me." Her life became simpler, quieter, but also filled with more genuine happiness. So my friends, as we continue on our journey, let's remember that it's okay to be selective. It's okay to draw boundaries and to take our time when it comes to relationships. After all, every day we have is a gift, and it's up to us to fill it with people and moments that bring us joy, not stress. And sometimes, keeping certain neighbors and relatives at a respectful distance is just what we need to live each day with a little more peace. We're never alone in these decisions. Many of us face similar situations. By sharing these stories, perhaps we can encourage each other to find the balance that feels right. Remember, setting boundaries isn't about being unkind. It's about making sure that the life we've built stays a happy and fulfilling one. With that, we can rest assured knowing that each small choice we make to nurture positive relationships will add to our well-being and make the years ahead as bright and as peaceful as they can be. As I sit here sharing these thoughts, I wonder what insights you, my friends, have gathered over the years. Have you encountered your own Toms, Marge, or Jim? Or maybe you've set boundaries with a relative, only to feel the weight lift from your shoulders. I invite you to share your stories, your own wisdom, and any little tips you've discovered along the way. Leave a comment below. Your words may be just what someone else needs to hear today. Let's walk this journey together, with respect, understanding, and the deep knowledge that each of us has something valuable to share.